Hello, and welcome to this webinar hosted by the CIEEM Academia Special Interest Group. I'm Des Delahaye. I'm a wildlife biologist at the Animal and Plant Health Agency and an ecological consultant at RSK Biocensus. I'm also the convener of the ASIG, where our aims are to try to encourage links between academia and ecological consultants and environmental managers, to promote educational opportunities for those groups of people, and to foster research to provide the evidence base to underpin practice in environmental management. If those subjects excite you in any way, then please do get in touch. We are always looking for new members of the ASIG. So anyway, on to our presentation for today. I'm very pleased to introduce you to Alexa Culver, who is legal counsel for RSK Wilding, which is a part of RSK Biocensus dealing with BNG and nature restoration. Alexa is an environmental and planning lawyer. She specialises in BNG and landscape recovery. She's also a member of the College of Experts at the Office of Environmental Protection, and she's been recognised as one of the most influential, impactful environmental lawyers of 2023 and 2025. So we are in very experienced and safe hands for today's talk. Alexa is going to talk to us today about part 3 of the Planning and Infrastructure Bill. There'll be an opportunity at the end for you to ask questions in person, or you can just post them in the chat during the course of the talk, and we'll try to address them at the end. So, without further ado, over to you, Alexa.
Thanks, Des. It's wonderful to be here. A quick warning, I don't have any slides, which I hope is okay, but to reassure you, if you don't see any slides, it's because there aren't any. I was struggling to think of what I would put in slides, perhaps pictures of legislation or animals being bludgeoned or something. I couldn't quite think of any kind of pictorial representation that would be particularly fun for this talk. So part 3 of the Planning and Infrastructure Bill is quite a major overhaul of how we have approached, in particular, our protection of certain special protected sites and species and habitats, typically under the habitats regulations. What part 3 of the planning bill does, in a bill that is designed for promoting growth and speeding up development, has at part 3 a whole section on development and nature recovery, as it's described. And in this session, I'm going to talk through the key principles behind part 3, the bits that have proved very controversial in terms of how it protects or doesn't protect nature, what it means in terms of mitigation hierarchy, and in general, the precautionary principle, and also give a bit of an update on where the bill is in its passage through Parliament, and some of the key amendments that have been proposed to try to address some of the quite serious shortcomings in part 3. So part 3 of the bill introduces a new concept of environmental delivery plans. And the idea is that government wants us to move away from a situation where developers consider their impacts on habitats and species and nature on a site-by-site, development-by-development site basis, and move it to what government's describing as a more strategic approach. The idea is that an environmental delivery plan will be put in place over a particular area. It could be a nationwide environmental delivery plan, or it could be a very hyper-local delivery plan. It could even be a delivery plan that's just for one specific development. There's no geospatial constraint, particularly to the range over which a new environmental delivery plan may apply. And that new environmental delivery plan will identify one or more environmental features within that area. So they might decide it's about newts in Newcastle. They might decide that it's about nutrient neutrality nationwide. It might be about a certain type of butterfly or air pollution or water quality. It can identify any kind of environmental feature. And what that environmental delivery plan will say is if anybody comes along to develop this type of development could be any type of development, they'll specify it, then instead of complying with any of the other normal laws that are there to protect this particular environmental feature, newts, nutrients, air pollution, you instead pay this levy. And the idea behind it is that it would give developers certainty if they're going to develop in a particular area, instead of spending money and, as government perhaps would say, wasting time on surveying this particular development site for what's actually there. Instead, we have an environmental delivery plan. You build here, if you build 5 houses, you need to pay this much money to account for the newts that you might have destroyed, or the nutrient neutrality, nutrient loads, or the contributions to pollutants in the air. And the way that the environmental delivery plans have a certain kind of safety barrier from a nature point of view is in what's called the overall improvement test. So what government has introduced is this idea, well, an environmental delivery plan may not be created and passed into law or passed into effect unless the Secretary of State thinks that whatever remedial action that might be listed in the environmental delivery plan, if delivered, would be sufficient to outweigh the harms of development in that environmental delivery plan area. So they define the harms, they defined the compensatory measures that Natural England sets out in an EDP, and if the Secretary of State thinks at its discretion that those remedial measures would be sufficient to outweigh the harms, then an environmental delivery plan may come along. So what then happens is that automatically disapplies the Habitats Regulations, the Wildlife and Countryside Act, the Protection of Badgers Act. There's a few acts listed there that just get automatically disapplied as soon as a developer makes their commitment to pay a levy. And so, or superficially, what sounds good about it is, well, there's going to be an overall improvement. That sounds good. Superficially, it sounds good that there's going to be money being collected that can be spent on strategic scale nature restoration that might be way more effective than site-by-site mitigation and compensation measures. And those are really the driving factors behind this proposed change in policy. But what this is blind to is, of course, the real problems of doing away with any kind of meaningful site-specific surveys. What species may or may not be present on a site in one year absolutely may not be the same as the following year. So what you have is a big, huge evidence gap where there may be no survey at all of what's there when an environmental delivery plan is put into place by Natural England, or there may be very cursory or very, very low standard, low quality surveys where there's a guess of what a particular environmental feature may or may not be present. So when a developer then comes along, they would build their house, they would pay a levy that's based on notional harms that have been guessed at the time that an environmental delivery plan is created. And these environmental delivery plans may go on for 10 years, the plan themselves. So the levies may be being collected over 10 years on the basis of a notional idea of what notional harms, notional development might cause 10 years previously. And so there's those big problems. There's also the complete loss of what we all recognize as the mitigation hierarchy. Because there's a fixed levy that is not necessarily going to be related to actual measured harms, there's no incentive or legal requirement for developers to at least try to avoid harms first. And that's been something that the green groups have campaigned and fought hard to get a mitigation hierarchy put into this regime so that at least developers are required to avoid harms before causing the harm and paying what has been called a cash to trash levy. Because the moment you lose your mitigation hierarchy, you've lost any incentive to reduce harm, you just pay your money and the problem has gone away. And so the creation of EDPs also causes problems for developers. So setting aside the profound ecological challenges in this kind of approach that divorces harms and compensation from the actual real harms and measured and delivered compensation. There's also the problems this actually causes for developers, because developers still need to comply with all normal laws wherever an EDP is not yet in place. And when an EDP is in place, an environmental delivery plan, it might be, say, just for newts in this particular area. So they would still need to continue to carry out all the other ordinary assessments and surveys that they would carry out for any other species and environmental issues. So it then means that there can be multiple layers of obligations and no meaningful savings for costs or time for developers, because they would still have their ecologist on site anyway, looking at other matters. And so this can actually add cost and risk and confusion for developers. Also, developers don't know when an environmental delivery plan is going to land and what environmental features it might cover. So it means that typically bringing forward a site for development can take many decades of promoting that land, getting it allocated for development and similar. So they're still going to need to understand the full range of environmental constraints, because they're never quite sure when an environmental delivery plan may land and what it might cover. So it actually adds uncertainty to the development process too. Also, the levy that a developer would need to pay is also likely to be quite complicated. I don't know how much experience people here may have had with community infrastructure levy that was introduced in 2010. Many of the ideas behind that are similar, just outside of a nature context. For community infrastructure levy, the idea was that there's infrastructure that's needed in local areas that no single developer should shoulder the burden of delivering. So they will pay a community infrastructure levy that goes to the local planning authority and it gets spent on infrastructure. Now, those levies are famously very complicated. It takes quite a lot of time for a developer to work out what their exposure to that levy might be. And rather like as was the case with community infrastructure levy, these new nature levies are designed primarily to preserve development viability. Now that makes an awful lot of sense for developers. You don't want issues to be pushing schemes outside of viability. However, another way of looking at it is the cost of compensating for nature loss is a real cost of development. If that development isn't viable, surely it shouldn't be going ahead. But what it means is that the money that is collected from a developer is unlikely to truly be enough to deliver sufficient compensation measures to actually seriously and properly compensate for those harms, because there will be a viability test that will mean that if it does tip developers over the edge of viability, they will either be exempt from paying the nature levy or will be able to pay a much reduced levy. So the way that the levy is calculated is divorced from the real cost of delivering the compensation for those environmental harms. So where that's a problem for developers is ostensibly, this sounds good, their viability is preserved. But in practice, what it means is that perhaps trickles of levy income might come into Natural England through an environmental delivery plan, but may never reach a critical sum sufficient to, for example, acquire the land or gain access to the land needed to deliver high quality, high integrity compensation measures. And where still for nature, those compensation measures might never be delivered because there's no legal obligation for them to be delivered by Natural England, or may be delivered very late, or may only be partly delivered after the irreparable harm has already been done, and after that unmeasured irreparable harm has already been done. So we may not even know what harm that is, because the principle here is to mean that developers don't need to do a site-specific survey, at least for that particular environmental feature that is covered in that particular environmental delivery plan. So to add to that too, there is also a clause in the legislation that says that Natural England may make the developers levy mandatory. They are allowed to do that at their discretion. So if they think that it should be mandatory, it can be made mandatory. They just need to say why they have made it mandatory. But there's no obligation for them to have any reason to make it mandatory. They just need to transparently say why. But there's no scope for anybody to challenge that. So what that also means is developers will lose the opportunity when a mandatory levy is set. They will lose the opportunity to reduce their harms and reduce their exposure to the levy because it's mandatory. And so they have to pay the cash, which is the cash they might have spent on reducing their harms. And so that's an extraordinarily counterproductive element of this legislation, and one that is currently being interrogated quite carefully with the Lords, because the extent to which levies are mandatory, on the one hand, sounds good, we make the developers pay, but on the other hand, we're actually getting in the way of their ability to actually reduce harm at source, which is all round, ultimately, typically better for nature. So that's a whistle-stop tour of environmental delivery plans. They could be over any area of land or specifically focused on a development. I didn't mention earlier, but they will be, Natural England can decide whenever they want whether to make an EDP, an environmental delivery plan. I suspect in reality, there will be a certain degree of political pressure to create EDPs that address a particular environmental sensitivity that might be blocking a certain controversial development, or something that's important for growth, like a new port or similar. And also Natural England may well be financially motivated to create an environmental delivery plan because they are, of course, entitled to collect these nature levies. And there is a wide amount of discretion over how that levy money is spent. While it's really important that the money is spent on those compensation measures for those harms that are specified in an environmental delivery plan, Natural England may still spend it on their own operations and their own administration. And in an absence of any kind of competitive environment, there may not be a great deal of incentive to be efficient in that administration. So an amount of that money could be lost very much to admin and operations. On top of that, and I only discovered this quite recently, the bill also provides that another government department, for example, Treasury, is allowed to collect that levy. When I first read that, I thought, oh, that makes sense. Natural England might just want to appoint a collecting body to just do it for them. But what I then realized is that if another department collects the cash, they have no obligation to spend it on nature at all. The obligation to spend the levy income on nature attaches only to Natural England under the legislation. So if it's collected and spent by another government department or public authority, it does not need to be spent on nature. And that's a big gaping problem in my view, alongside many other challenges with Part 3, but that to me is a really central one. And it draws us to really the question of Natural England's role in this. Already, and it's really horrible to see, Natural England has been taking quite a battering as Part 3 has brought into sharp focus the role of our regulators. And instead of us having had a comprehensive independent review into, for example, how our habitat regulations are being enforced, what the developer experience is, some of the challenges around evidence gaps, how those gaps are being filled, the challenges around an underfunded regulator, the challenges around really making sure there's sound and robust evidence to support confident, rapid decision-making. There was no independent review to properly understand where are the problems here. Instead, Part 3 has come along to effectively try to eradicate those problems, but accidentally is creating some other structural problems. And that is in the role it creates for Natural England. All principles of good regulation require separations of power, ensuring no conflicts of interest, ensuring no financial conflicts of interest with regulators, and ensuring that there is no one is ever marking their own homework. What Part 3 has done is designed in an extraordinary concentration of unchecked and conflicted power into the hands of Natural England. Now, whether that was by design, whether it was just an innocent mistake, whether it wasn't thought about, is very difficult to tell. But what Natural England would have under Part 3 is an unprecedented situation where they may fund themselves through the destruction of the very nature that they're there to protect and the levies that they collect as a result of that destruction. So Natural England become financially invested in the destruction of nature. Now, that's a criticism rightly that can be drawn in all sorts of compensation schemes, and there's huge varied perspectives on cash to trash and people being financially motivated to trash nature. And of course, that there's some very, very strong and important policy design work that's needed to mitigate those unwanted outcomes. For example, a strong, deeply entrenched mitigation hierarchy is the biggest protector against people wanting to run off and make money out of trashing nature. What we've got here in part 3 is the extraordinary situation of no mitigation hierarchy at all, and the very party that stands to gain the most from the destruction of the nature is being our nature regulator. And that really is quite an extraordinary situation that in the Lords debates recently has been described as untenable, unwinnable for Natural England. It is a poison chalice because, as I say, they are financially rewarded for the destruction of nature that they're there to protect. They have no party with legal oversight over what they do. There is no structure for them to report to anybody but themselves. They are responsible for delivering the compensation measures under a new environmental delivery plan, but there's no legal obligation on them to deliver. There's no punishment, for want of a better way of putting it. I couldn't think of a better way of describing it, if they don't deliver those compensation measures. All that Natural England needs to do is provide a mid-term report, so say 5 years into the environmental delivery plan period, they will report back on the actions that have been taken. There's no accountability if actions haven't been taken or if they aren't successful. And importantly, the statute even says in black and white, if they haven't implemented any compensation measures, explain why, which is an outward recognition that many of these compensation measures may just never be implemented, and that's just the way it is. And so in this extraordinary position where Natural England designs the environmental delivery plans, Natural England delivers the environmental delivery plans, they monitor the progress of the environmental delivery plans, and they collect and spend the levies that are raised through environmental delivery plans, they are in an extraordinarily conflicted position. And I wouldn't be surprised if that is an area of focus, perhaps, as the bill starts to reach the Lords report stage, and perhaps those could be fixes in that area could bring the most confidence to what is an extraordinarily flawed structure. It's just a recipe for disaster. And then finally, there is the impacts that part 3 may have on the emerging, what you might call sort of nature markets that have built up under things like biodiversity net gain. What has been mobilizing as we've all been anticipating laws getting stronger for nature as being the sort of trajectory, we'd all been anticipating laws getting stronger for nature protection. More and more landowners, ecologists, charities, NGOs, farmers have come together to start delivering environmental nature recovery projects in anticipation that developers and other companies will have a need to invest into those nature recovery projects as what's being sort of called the nature markets. So by delivering these gains ahead of the harms occurring, by delivering these schemes for nature early, there's a win-win. And those companies that increasingly are under increasing pressure from their customers, from their shareholders, from their funders, by tightening laws, they are increasingly inclined to fund and flow cash towards these self-started nature recovery projects that are springing up all over the place, and including nutrient neutrality and similar. The problem with EDPs is that because they may land anywhere, they could kill the demand for natural capital and ecosystem services anywhere too. which then means for anybody looking to invest into bringing forward these solutions for developers ahead of time and invest in delivering high integrity nature recovery projects, they never know when a new Natural England DDP might come and swoop down and land in that area and say, sorry, developers, sorry, corporates, you can't buy those high integrity nature assets. You have to pay our mandatory levy instead. And of course, it's much cheaper anyway, because it's there to preserve your viability of development rather than to truly cover the cost of delivering the compensation in a high integrity framework. And so the perverse outcome of that is that developers going through the planning system now will be losing access to existing market-led alternative natural capital solutions to ease them through the planning process. For example, nutrient mitigation schemes that are all over the place. And so that's another unfortunate outcome, is that because an EDP may land anywhere, it kills the investment case for investment into nature everywhere. And that has an extraordinarily cooling impact on the appetite that so many organizations had to bring forward schemes that do what's right for nature. And then what I'm wondering is whether it's good to stop now, if anyone's got any questions at all, or give everyone an opportunity to ask any questions, or if there's any area of particular focus that you might want me to go on to. And after this little opportunity for questions, I'll be happy to talk through how the bill has gone through Parliament so far. Hello. I can see Tatjana's hand.
Well, if I may, Alexa, hello, good to see you.
Hello, yeah, good to see you.
Bearing with me. Well, you've just blown my mind yet again, but I could just maybe pick up on that last part that you were talking about, the failure of natural capital models of, you know, under the risk that EDPs land and sort of kill that early investment. I was just also reflecting on the risk you'd raised about the delay to, well, first the failure to baseline assess what is there, and then the later extraordinary delays in acting on the monitoring or reports that might be produced, and the then further delay of reflecting on what to do about those reports that might build in another decade, bearing in mind that SSIs weren't really reassessed for their favourable status for the last decade. So, you know, it's that constant underinvestment. But I just was reflecting on those two matters and the loss of the useful vehicle of the Environmental Liability Directive, which used to which used to be a nice vehicle in order to look forward at what professional judgment might deem to be a reasonable case of forecast loss. Because that loss, I think, is quite, or loss of the use of that vehicle in business cases, for example, for adaptation and catching up with our obligations towards adaptation, which had fallen behind, I think is quite quite a hole in the system. It's it would allow, if it were brought and tied to EDPs, it would allow the EDPs to be used in the sort of sense of looking forward at what might be the trend of loss and acting now in parallel with that monitoring, so that early investment and baselining were brought in line with what trends were being assessed in real time and what professionals might anticipate to be lost, rather than what has been lost and what impact has been made retrospectively. It might be applied strategically in that sense, you know, so not tied to development and removing that restoration hinges always on development rather than on strategic delivery across land use frameworks.
Yeah. Yeah, so I totally agree. I mean, what there is an exceptional opportunity to really collect lots of cash and really look at this more about landscape scale restoration that is intelligently designed. And that there is so much that could be done with that. But the problem we've got here is that the primary purpose of Part 3 is to deliver growth, and not through an ecologically literate sense of growth, but through getting development done more quickly. And so you're absolutely right, there's a huge opportunity. And I think, you know, Natural England are likely to be trying to bring in as much integrity as is humanly possible to a system that doesn't want a developer to measure its impact on a site-by-site basis. But you're right, there is so much that could be done. You can just tell this is not what Part 3 has been designed to do. But I would hope and hold a lot of hope that the good folk at Natural England will be building in all the protections that they can. And the biggest challenge is going to be, will they make enough money through the levy to actually deliver what's needed? And what happens if that money goes off to the Treasury and gets spent on entirely other things? And how much they are subservient to a Secretary of State for Housing, Communities and Local Government, which is the absolute driving thrust of this legislation, right at the front of the planning bill. It is the planning bill, it's about planning, it's about growth. But you're right, there's hope and a lot of opportunity for brilliant things to happen. They're just not designed into this as it stands, if that makes sense. And yeah, any other questions from anybody?
So there's a question in the chat, Alexa.
Oh, let's have a peek.
So the question is, do we know what will happen to district level licensing once EDPs come into play? So
I think, unfortunately, well, fortunately or unfortunately, I'm not sure, depending on who the audience is, I think that district level licensing will be quite one of the first things to be subsumed into environmental delivery plans. I've heard in the Lords debates, it's been mentioned a couple of times that Natural England's already working on a newts EDP. And I think it's because newts are one of the very small list of species, if not the only species, that there is any sense of ecological acceptance that a strategic approach can work. So I think it's an early contender for EDPs, and it will be the kind of thing that could generate probably quite a lot of levy income for Natural England. So I think where an EDP for newts applies, DLL, this also leads slightly to the question of whether the levy is mandatory or voluntary. And that's, to me, a very huge bit of information that we don't know yet, because if the levy is voluntary and the DLL process is less costly for a developer, then the developer will pick the DLL option, because they typically will pick the least costly one if it's also quicker. But for as long as DLL takes longer and costs more, they will choose the EDP levy. But if the EDP levy is made mandatory, then there's no competition between DLL. DLL will be killed in that area, if that makes sense.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, there's a question from Jez online. Jez, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Oh, hi. Yeah, Jez Martin, an LPA ecologist. I think one of the things, obviously, is whether they get enough money to do these the plans. But one of the issues is, if you've got the money, you don't necessarily then actually manage to get the land. And the reason why I say that is prior to BNG, for my LPA, the developer paid over £250,000 to compensate lost. So they paid their cash to trash. That's several years ago. We've so far only spent £70,000 because trying to find the land, the right land, and then being gazumped. Some people coming in selling stupid money over the years, and more recently, obviously we don't. My council doesn't buy land; we give it to other organisations. So I won't give it say who. So they've bought one organisation, bought some money, and recently offered some money to another organisation, which you will all know. I won't say. And the landowner, the current landowner, decided not to sell it to this national organisation, but to sell it to another farmer at a higher price. So and they've and just because you got the money, if you do get the money, you won't necessarily get the land, or you might get the land, but many years afterwards. So the case over 5 years ago, and only spent a fraction of land, fraction of the money.
You're hitting the nail right on the head there, because this is the big challenge. You can see why they've designed it this way, because for as long as a developer needed to have secured the land to avoid those so-called Grampian conditions, for as long as a developer needed to have legally secured the compensation area, at least in some kind of legal framework for delivery, before the commencement of development, it meant at least everybody's minds were focused on getting this done, and they would find ways to get it done. It's amazing how resourceful you can be, from a developer's point of view, when your commencement of development is resting on it. But admittedly, it's not easy, and it takes time. What this system does is it utterly divorces the delivery of compensation from the harm. So the money is paid cash, as you say, as I say, and the money may never be spent. And yes, they might struggle to get hold of the land. They might struggle to get hold of enough land. Now, interestingly, but also what they may also do is just channel that cash to generalized payments to land managers in a totally different part of the country, to ask them to manage their land in a slightly better way for lapwing, or in a slightly better, they might manage their existing woodland a bit better. So when Natural England spends the money, it has a sort of very weak ring fence in the legislation that says it must be spent on compensation measures that relate to the harms that the EDP thinks is being caused. But that could be generalized management payments to landowners somewhere else, almost akin to an SFI payment or countryside stewardship payment. So some things might be attempted at huge wetland restoration projects, or it's just channeled into broadly equivalent nature beneficial payments that may or may not get monitored, and that may bear no relationship at all to the area in which the development took place.
Yes, I mean, also a recipient of contract stewardship payments, and obviously not everything is checked by that's really delivering it, but also just going back to the cost of land. And again, this afternoon, I should say, discussion with a national organisation about buying land. They've just been horrified about how much the cost of land has gone up this year. Presumably, partly from what I've seen, because of people thinking they can get money out of BNG, whatever. But apparently, even just this year, in where I am, the cost of land is going up quite a lot already this year, and potentially with this, people might think, well, we're going to hold up for more money, so actually it's diminishing return.
Precisely. Interestingly, also another angle, and I don't quite know what the implications are, is Natural England's also given, on top of this concentration of power that I described, they're also given compulsory purchase powers over land. So it will be really interesting to see whether they use that, how they use that.
And also the council know about compulsory power purchase. In the past, in the 70s, that's quite a quick method. Nowadays, generally, you're talking potentially a couple of years, if not more. And because more times than not, most likely we're talking about some will go through, but some will be objected to, and can take quite a time. And importantly, a lot of money, which obviously the legal fees will be presumably funded from the developer's payment. So again, going into admin rather than actually delivery on time.
Exactly. And of course, critically, not going on avoidance of harm either,
So we've got another questioner online. Kamal, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Thanks, Richard. Hi, Alexa. Good listening to you. I'm absolutely
Thank you.
shocked, actually, to be honest. But my question was, if in the implementation or the collecting of levies, surely there would have to be some sort of biodiversity accounting for what is potentially going to be lost.
Well, exactly. So this is another criticism in the Lords. One of the Lords said something along the lines of, this entire part 3 is completely ecologically and economically illiterate at the moment. Yeah. It doesn't recognize, how long are these things going to be managed for? How are they going to price up the cost of delivering these compensation measures in the long term? And critically, how on earth can you have any relationship to the true cost and biodiversity accounting of what's being delivered when the first primary purpose of the levy in the legislation is to preserve development viability? So it really is a tokenistic payment that is likely to bear no meaningful relationship to what is lost, the difficulty in recreating what's lost, the effort or monitoring required for those challenging habitat types or challenging species. Now, again, this is where I go back to what Tatiana said, which is perhaps what I can imagine is that Natural England will be doing everything they can to bring as much integrity to an environmental delivery plan as they possibly can. But they will be under considerable pressure on the levy to make sure it preserves development viability. And so suddenly, the key principle that there are some sites that is just uneconomical to develop because of the richness of the biodiversity there is gone when an EDP exists, because a very affordable levy can be paid and may or may not get spent on compensation measures there or elsewhere.
It struck me as an analogy to people going to hunt in South Africa, and paying money to be able to destroy nature.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Exactly, and I'm being sort of a bit deliberately perverse, but even then, they'd at least pay more for a more trophy species. It sounds horrible to say it like that, but here there isn't even that. The overall improvement test is this very theoretical, unscientific test that's discretionary. And as long as the Secretary of State thinks there'll be an overall improvement to nature if these notional compensation measures are notionally delivered,
totally disregards the science that we know is there. I mean, they try to do the same thing with climate change. They say no, there's no such thing as the Keeling curve, or that carbon dioxide doesn't affect global temperatures. So it's a similar thing to that sort of school of thought, but it totally disregards the science. We are losing biodiversity at a drastic rate, and it's because of habitat loss.
Exactly,
for whatever reason.
Exactly, and it's disregarding the science, and it's disregarding the true financial and operational constraints to delivering compensation in the real world on the ground. That's just pushed to later for Natural England to solve in its horrendously conflicted position.
And almost worse than disregarding the science, there may be a temptation when formulating these EDPs to introduce pseudoscience, cherry picking, and so on, ill-founded ideas and so on, to try and prop up, what's underpinning the EDP.
Precisely, because what we have currently in the habitats regulations is this, there needs to be a degree of scientific certainty beyond sort of reasonable scientific doubt, or whatever the technical phrase is. But there's a sense that there's a degree of scientific certainty that this would not cause harm to the conservation status of this species or what have you. What this converts it to completely is we do away with any idea of scientific certainty. Reasonable certainty, it's recognized there's going to be margins of error, But what that we move to under EDPs is Natural England must have due regard to best available science. So it's just having due regard to it, but there's no need to have any reasonable sense of scientific certainty. Yeah, exactly. And even then, the scientific robustness of the EDP is not factored into at all when the Secretary of State decides whether it passes the overall improvement test. So again, while Natural England merrily and probably not so merrily is under pressure to pull together an environmental delivery plan, they must have due regard to the best available science. But the Secretary of State can still pass it into law if the best available science hasn't been considered. You know, it could still pass the overall improvement test. And who's to say they haven't had regard to it? And even having regard to it doesn't mean you follow it. The legal test for having regard to something is you say, well, I thought about it and I ignored it. I didn't have to actually follow it. I didn't have to be reasonably scientifically certain that this would avoid harm to the conservation status of this species or habitat, whatever it might be. So it's very vague, and of course deliberately so. You can see that this is a real backlash, a reaction, a move to try to simplify and speed up, and that's what all of this is trying to do. But I think what the accident of this is that when planning authorities are coming to decide on developers' planning applications, it could very well be a material consideration that there's a failing or failed environmental delivery plan that's sucking up levies from developers. The money's going straight to Treasury and being spent on something completely different. I'm afraid we're not going to grant planning permission for this because the material consideration is there's uncompensated loss of our precious habitats in this local area. And I'm afraid the EDP doesn't work. It doesn't deliver what it should. And as a planning authority, we consider this to be a material consideration that this planning permission should be refused. So again, by it going so badly and being designed so badly with such structural flaws like the unchecked concentration of power in Natural England and the lack of any legal obligations could backfire and mean that planning applications are refused.
Yeah, I can see how those disputes could easily develop. So I'm going to try and steer us towards an element of hope, perhaps, given that this is has been quite depressing. So where is the hope? Where is the political pushback, the opportunity for things to change in your perspective, Alexa?
So the hope comes from the hope comes from actually how the Lords have interrogated this legislation at what's known as the Lords Committee stage. So the bill has it goes through the Houses of Parliament, Houses of Commons first. It has its first reading, second reading, then it has a sort of a committee stage where it's debated, and then it has a report stage where they come out with some suggested amendments. So that all happened back early in the year. Then it goes up to the House of Lords. Now, the process of the bill in the Commons was really quite odd, and that's when I first became aware of this bill and couldn't quite believe what I was seeing, because it was being described to the MPs as a win-win for nature and the economy. And of course, as you've heard on this call, it's definitely not a win for nature, and it's probably not a win for the economy. And I couldn't quite believe what I was seeing, which is where this all began. I mean, I was just like a normal, non-campaigning, normal lawyer, and I just couldn't quite believe what I was seeing. So then Chris Hinchcliffe, which is again another beacon of hope, a Labour MP, saw the environmental dangers when it was in the House of Commons, and he actually rallied around a decent number of MP rebels to go against the bill, which is extraordinary when you consider the sheer majority that Labour had in their thumping majority in their election. So it was a very brave move by Chris Hinchcliffe, and he put forward an amendment to try to address these environmental concerns by saying, before a developer pays a levy, the conservation status of the relevant environmental feature must first have been improved. So he bring the benefits early, and then the developer can pay a levy, and that sort of restores that integrity factor, encouraging early investment in nature and far more integrity in the whole thing. He actually managed to get a lot of support in the Labour Parliamentary Party, which is quite extraordinary because the whip would have told them all to support the bill. In the end, his rebellion didn't succeed, but it was an amazing sign of recognition that they could see the dangers in this bill, but it took a while for the dangers to materialise after it had been repeatedly described as a win-win, and everyone thought it really was a win-win. So the good news was the problems in it emerged during the Commons readings, and Chris Hinchcliffe was a ringleader. Sadly, his rebellion didn't succeed in the Commons, and he then had the whip removed and was roundly punished for the rebellion, but that's a different story. Now it's in the Lords, and the Lords have really interrogated this bill. They've seen the problems from the beginning, and they are not afraid to interrogate and to challenge. And so the Lords have been engaging, in particular Lord Lucas, Lord Gascoigne, Baroness Coffey, and they have been really making sure that the full problems in this, and largely as I've just described to you now, are aired in the Lords, and they were aired beautifully. The Lords were debating till 4:30 in the morning last week because government wouldn't give them the parliamentary time with the sheer number of amendments that they have been presenting. And so that was an extraordinary level of commitment. And what we're now at is at the report stage. So this is the bit where the Lords take all the amendments that have been tabled. One amendment, my amendment was we should scrap part 3 completely. Some people say that that's politically naive and radical. And I mean, I'm happy to say that that's naive. I did find it quite funny for it to be radical though, because all I'm saying is for reform like that, it just needs a manifesto mandate and some consultation at least. And I didn't see that as very radical, but it apparently is. But the Lords are saying, one, what is the point in part 3? The case hasn't been made for why this is needed, which is a great level of opposition, which is quite unusual really at the Lords stage. Then there are amendments that want to limit the scope of part 3. Let's say maybe it should apply to nutrients only, because maybe there are real nutrient loads are really coming from agricultural runoff and stuff, and maybe we can cope with making part 3 apply to nutrients only. We'll have a nutrient neutrality EDP, and all the species can be kept protected as they currently are, and other habitats, etc. Then other amendments are looking to address the levy itself and to ring fence the levy. So an amendment that I proposed, that if we have to accept part 3 as really happening, which I still psychologically don't want to, but if we had to, the amendment I've tabled via Lord Gascoigne is we need to make sure that all levy income, no matter who collects it, spends it on nature, at least. You know, that's the one saving protection that I've pushed forward, and I hope that that amendment will succeed. The green groups and NGOs have done an incredible job in getting the government to already bring in some sort of protections, but they were a bit wishy-washy again. They don't really stack up legally. So unfortunately, even though government did try to address the NGOs' concerns, their proposals were very, very meaningless really in any kind of legal sense. But the NGOs are still pushing to introduce a mitigation hierarchy. We've at least got to ask developers to try to avoid harms first. And that's the kind of broadish range. And then, some amendments about wanting to make sure that Natural England is overseen by somebody and trying to address the problem of the concentration of conflicts and powers. So those are the sorts of amendments that are being tabled by the Lords in what is quite an uncharacteristically hostile attack by the Lords, who would typically constitutionally not really want to do much more than tweaks here and there. So it's a sign that the poor quality of the bill for nature and development is being recognised well in the Lords. So the next stage is that in late October, the Lords will produce a report. And what the Lords will effectively do is choose which of these amendments do they all agree as a majority need to get shoved into this bill. And what will happen is there's a vote of the Lords on each of those amendments. So these amendments need to be popular enough among the full number of Lords to mean that they get shoved back into the bill, and then the bill gets effectively posted back to the Commons, and the Commons are then in a position where they need to then consider what the Lords are saying there should be in there and decide whether to accept or reject those amendments. If the Lords are being very confident and bullish and forceful on this, which I hope they are, and I've been writing briefings to them to make sure they've got all the legal, technical understanding behind where these problems are, then the bill may end up in what's called a ping pong process, where government rip all of the amendments back out again, gets sent back up to the Lords shove them back in again, gets sent back down to the Commons. And in that ping pong process, either the bill dies a death, or they perhaps take part 3 out and let the rest of the bill go through and deal with part 3 later, or some kind of middle ground is reached. So there's a lot of uncertainty about how that will unfold, but what I'm really confident of is that in the face of initial confusion, no meaningful consultation, the bill being wrongly described as not regressive on environmental protections, which is false, the bill being described wrongly as a win-win to the public and to parliamentarians, I'm amazed and pleased that we've got to this point now where the Lords understand the issues, government understands the issues, and now it's going to be how are they addressed. And I have hope that at the very least part 3 will come out less devastating than it currently is.
Right. Well, thanks for that note of optimism. And just finally, very quickly, what might anyone on the call today or anybody else do to help expedite a more beneficial outcome? Sorry,
was that a question for me? Oh yes. Yeah, sorry, I thought you were asking everybody else. Sorry. I was dazzled by all the hand claps. So sorry. No, say that again. So what could people in this room do to help with this?
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. So definitely write to your MPs non-stop. If you like it, it's so important that MPs understand how heartfelt our love of nature is. One of the things that's happened here, and I think this is a symptom of the world having moved on quite a bit, is I think government wrongly believed that it was only the NGOs that they needed to sweeten up and get happy with this bill, and only properly consulted with NGOs as part of this process, not with the public, and certainly not with CIEEM. So Sally has done an amazing job of briefing the peers and of really lobbying to help them understand the ecology sector know a lot about this. We know what works, we know what doesn't work, and we're also here to smooth this process and make it work for development and nature. So Sally has been amazing. Individually, also do what you can to raise awareness within your local planning authorities, where anyone here is an LPA ecologist. And also within your organizations generally. If you're ever speaking to a developer, do make sure they understand that there's every chance these levies are mandatory. Because what's happened also here is that developers have, I think, really understandably thought, well, this bill's for us, so it's going to be good. We're not paying too much attention to it. We're not asking lawyers to read it. It's all about speeding up development and protecting viability, so it's only going to be good. What they don't realize is these levies could be mandatory, take away their choice away from how they deal with things, and it's an extra tax on development that could lead to planning refusal. So, and if there's anybody that wants to talk about what all of this means, I literally will talk about it all day long to anybody who wants to talk about it. So please do feel free to get in touch with me and put in touch with me anybody that you're working with that's keen to know more. Because local government, for example, already voiced concerns about what this could mean for the planning system. And I think that local government have rightly been understandably distracted by things like local government reorganisation, haven't necessarily been able to think about what this bill means for them. So we're at this push now where the more our MPs can understand the problems this creates, the unintended problems, then the better all round.
Yeah.
And yeah, I hope that's a useful enough rallying cry.
That's great. Well, that's about all we've got time for today. So it really just remains for me to say thanks a lot, Alexa. I mean, that was a great talk.
Thank you.
Depressing subject. A few notes of hope at the end, but
we'll do a little dance at the end to cheer ourselves up.
Not depressing. Call to arms.
A really great, well-informed talk.
Oh,
so
I'd love to
very
talk to Paz. Just to say, the note there, I'd absolutely love to talk to the Planning Advisory Service, and there's a few contacts I have there, and anyone that could put me in touch, please do, and I would love to do it.
Great stuff. I hope we'll get lots of communication.
So do you have an email address? Is it in the chat?
Yeah. So I put it here now. Let me do it now. RSKWilding.com.
I will certainly be speaking to my MP.
Brilliant. Yeah,
and local councillors as well, because they're the LPAs, the local planning authorities. They also have a stake in this, especially in terms of BNG. They've done a lot of preparation for BNG, and then to have it carpet pulled from under the,
Absolutely. Well, look, I'm going to have to wrap things up, I'm afraid, because we'll get kicked off this platform any minute. But thanks, Alexa. That was fabulous. And thanks, everybody, for tuning in. Next month, we're going to be talking about the relationship between green-winged orchids and mycorrhizal fungi. So keep your eyes peeled on your inboxes for more information on that and the joining instructions. So until then, it's goodbye from me.
Cheerio, take care.